Welcome to Psychoanalysis You, the podcast of the American Psychoanalytic Association. I'm your host, Dr. Gail Saltz. I'm a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist. This is Psychoanalysis You. My guest today is Dr. Mark Smaller. He is an adult, adolescent, and child psychoanalyst with offices in Saugatuck and Grand Rapids, Michigan. In addition to his private practice, he consults to schools and to nonprofits, corporations. Dr. Smaller is past president of the American Psychoanalytic Association, former board member of the International Psychoanalytic Association, and Executive Director Emeritus of the Neuropsychoanalysis Foundation in New York. As former public advocacy department head of the American Psychoanalytic Association, Dr. Smaller led lobbying efforts in the United States Congress regarding the impact of trauma on children from community violence. He is founding director of the Project Realize Foundation, having created an in-school treatment and research project in Chicago. Project Realize was awarded the 2012 Award for Excellence by the American Association for Child Psychoanalysis and was featured in the New York Times in January of 2010. Currently, Project Realize supports patients and families in West Michigan unable to afford private psychotherapy and is funded through grants and private donations. Welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So, can you tell us a bit about how you brought psychoanalysis to your community beyond the consulting room? I mean, I know you're in practice, you see patients, but the work outside your office you do has been really transformative for even more people.
So, probably about 18 years ago, I was doing my private practice, but also on, I think, 4 different foundation boards. And 3 of these foundations raised funds for various psychoanalytic organizations. But after reviewing grants for a number of years, I thought, well, I want to be doing something like that out in the community. I want to get funded. And so I had an opportunity to visit an alternative school in Chicago, just outside Chicago, Cicero. And I went out at the request of a social worker at the school. And this was an alternative school where kids were expelled from the regular high school, usually for gang-related behavior. And I went and visited one time, and I was about ready to leave after meeting with students and teachers and such, and the principal. And I turned as I was walking through the metal detector to leave. I said to the principal, maybe I'll come back just one more time. And he said, sure. And so I went back the next week, much to the upset of my early Wednesday morning patients, because I had to reschedule. And I visited again, sat in on a group, met with teachers, the principal. And as I was leaving, I turned and said to the principal, something came up in the group, maybe I'll come back just one more time. And I ended up going back for the next 15 years and actually started a project where we saw kids individually and in groups at the school. But what was particularly meaningful to me is that I was leaving at that time when I was living in Chicago, I was leaving my Michigan Avenue office to go out to this alternative school in Cicero where no one had even heard of the term psychoanalysis. However, once in the school, working with some students in groups and individually working with teachers, suddenly psychoanalysis, it was clear, had a role in this school. And in my mind, the school in that instance became the center of that community for many families, not just students, and that psychoanalytic ideas, if transformed in meaningful, user-friendly ways, could be hugely affected. So we started keeping research, kids that were involved in our project, graduation rates went up. We had at some point, I think it was 32 different gangs represented in that school. But when kids would be in the school, the gang stuff would be set aside, and they were just interested in wanting to be listened to and responded to, which is the foundation of psychoanalytic treatment. So it worked. And I've since relocated to Southwest Michigan, and we're doing the same thing in a high school and middle school there. And again, it works. And for me, particularly satisfying is that everything that I've used and learned in my office and over many years can be useful in many places, like a school setting and such.
So in a school setting, can you drill down and explain how would you have a classroom full of kids, and you're really talking about kids who maybe in terms of their struggle and their suffering have some oppositional defiant disorder or have environmental trauma that has led them to behave in certain ways that are maladaptive, let's say. How do you individually get to a kid on a person-to-person basis? And do you also, after that, do you work with teachers as well?
Okay, so let me give you an example that I think speaks to those two questions. We'll call the student Benny. So Benny was 17, 18 years old by the time he was in one of our groups. And Benny would come to school, but the teachers reported that he would come and sit in class and really not do anything. And at some point, maybe he would put his head down to go to sleep because he was so tired. He was probably second or third generation of kids in his family in gangs. He was living at that time with his father. And whether he came to school or not, it became clear didn't really matter to anyone at home. But it was so striking that he would come to school every day. So this was brought to my attention by one of the teachers who felt completely helpless. I don't know how to get through to him. And I said, well, we could focus on why he's not coming to school. That's one way of looking at it. But in terms of our approach in Project Realize, and approach that we've developed more extensively since, let's look at what's getting Benny out of bed every morning and bringing him to school. Something's happening here that draws him here. He really doesn't need to come. He could drop out. His father probably wouldn't care. Something's going on. Well, we started talking about it. With the school is one reliable, predictable place. He knows that there are teachers there, some peers who care about him. He knows that the school schedule is going to be the same every day. He can rely on that. And then in the discussion, one of the teachers who was, I think it was an English teacher, said, actually what Benny does in my class is he's got this little book that he keeps and he sketches in the book and he shows it to you. He said, "What?" She says, "Well, I look and they're really seriously good sketching of other students or something that's happened outside of school." I said, "Well, let's create more of an opportunity for him to do that." I'm summarizing about 6-8 months of intervention. By the time Benny graduated, he had applied to a fine arts school in Chicago. He was the first kid in his family to graduate high school and went on, and to this day, the last I heard a number of years ago, was working as a graphic designer somewhere. So we have plenty of those kinds of stories where we're working not only with the student, but we're also giving the teacher a perspective that she can make use of in terms of understanding a student and individualizing the uniqueness of that student and how to best be useful to them.
So educating educators using psychoanalytic concepts to help their students make meaning.
Absolutely.
Of their time.
Yeah. The alternative school, interestingly enough, most of the teachers were relatively new in their career because most experienced teachers didn't want to be at the alternative school, okay? It became very clear to me that some of these young teachers who, are fresh out of college with their teaching certificates, they're terrific at coming up with curriculum planning. They work very hard every night to plan for the next day. And then they come in and the students aren't paying attention or are occupied or preoccupied with other things. So what we would do is help the teacher not only to develop their curriculum, but to make it user-friendly to these kids at this moment in time. And in doing that and addressing some issues going on in the classroom, some dynamics or what, that might facilitate engaging the student. How do you engage the student in learning in a way that they can get excited about it and they're not just doing it to comply or conform with what they're supposed to do?
Now, this population that you're talking about, essentially an inner city population, a lot of them struggle socioeconomically. They struggle with community violence. They struggle with, as you're talking about, disrupted homes, or maybe even lack of much home structure at all. How have you found psychoanalytic concepts to be helpful in understanding the kinds of suffering these kids will experience and then applying that in reducing those issues?
So we have developed a very particular treatment modality. My wife at some point joined the school as an intern and then eventually became the director of the school, of our school project. And what we developed, forgive me for a moment, out of a particular psychoanalytic theoretical framework, self-psychology, something that developed and originated in Chicago with Heinz Kohut, we took that approach. And one of the things that Kohut had talked about is that a self-psychological approach hopefully focuses on what he called the forward edge of somebody moving, an instinct to move forward. So if you focus on that you tease out what aspects of this person you can respond to in a way that's going to facilitate development where development has otherwise been stuck. We could apply that in this setting. I should say I apply that in my office, my private office as well. So you are absolutely correct. These kids, some of them have experienced unspeakable trauma at home. They've witnessed horrendous violence in the streets, and we could talk about that all day and forever. But that's not what they want to talk about. What they wanted to address in groups and in individual treatment, they have aspirations, no different than any of our kids have aspirations to move forward. And if we could tease those aspirations, those very personal ambitions out and respond to those, the impact of the trauma starts to be diffused in a certain way. There's another way to think about living. There's another way of behaving that will take you forward. And that's been our focus. And we use it with teachers and explain such to teachers so they can make use of that as well. But it's a very psychoanalytic concept and treatment idea, but it's useful in all kinds of settings.
So it's interesting because really, I guess I'll say non-psychoanalytically, you're injecting hope as a model when these kids come from what feels like a hopeless, repetitive situation that they don't have to be destined, I guess this is psychoanalytic, to repeat.
Yeah.
And teachers who probably have watched the repetition for so long also might learn that they don't have to repeat.
I think one of the foundations of psychoanalysis, in addition to access to the unconscious transference that we relive in our current relationships, our relationships from the past, especially the difficult ones. But I think the one concept that doesn't get mentioned enough that is a foundation of what Freud discovered was this compulsion to repeat. And I think of it as this kind of hope springs eternal. If I just try it again, even though it's a self-destructive pattern, if I just try it again, maybe this time it will work. But if we can identify that kind of pattern, whether it's at an alternative school in Cicero, Illinois, or in a private office on Michigan Avenue, or in my office in Saugatuck, Michigan, if we can identify those patterns and help somebody to begin to reflect on going in this direction actually doesn't work, but what is the fear that's keeping you from moving in another direction? That then initiates a feeling of hope and, maybe my life can be different. Maybe my ambitions are more than reasonable and I can act on them.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm sure many of these communities don't have the resources and the access to partake of individual mental health care. Two questions. One is, you do this in groups, probably partially because the ability to supply individually to each student isn't realistic. So how does that work differently in a group? Because that isn't the typical model, of course, for psychoanalytic treatment. And also, how do you deal with this economically? How do we provide access to, this is the next generation. This is the age to get these people essentially, right? Before they've already moved, as you're alluding to, from the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
How can we intervene there? How do we provide that access?
Yeah, so, and I've said this recently in my little town of 2000 in Southwest Michigan when I work with the principal and the staff at that high school. I should mention that when I relocated to Saugatuck and I met with the principal and said we might be able to find something useful to do here at the school. And he said, well, Dr. Smaller, we don't really have gangs here in Saugatuck. He said, but we do have this group of students, he said, and I referred to them as the Lost Boys. And I said, the Lost Boys? He goes, yeah, these are students, girls and boys, who by the time they're freshmen, he said, I can already tell that things are not going well. We're aware that there are things going on at home. We've tried to refer the student and the family for treatment. Even if economically they can manage it, they don't necessarily follow through. He said, is this program that you're suggesting, is this something that would be useful? And I said, absolutely. Not only can we do this individually, but yes, in groups and in working with teachers. But one story that he particularly appreciated, at the alternative school, we would try to get parents involved. We did some individual treatment. We hired therapists from the Chicago Institute to come and provide some individual treatment. But we used to try to get the parents engaged. And I made a terrible mistake the first year of the project. I said, well, if they don't come, let's do home visits. I mean, I grew up as a social worker. Home visits were not unusual. Well, the social worker would set up a time, and this was a mostly Hispanic community. The social worker would go out, knock on the door. At the time, no one would answer the door. The parents would not come in. One day, right before the holiday break in December, they had traditionally at the school, they would invite the parents. They'd have a potluck breakfast. Parents would bring food. Students would come and share food and what. And I'm standing with the principal, Rudy Hernandez, and I noticed the alternative school only had about 60 students, and I'm counting. There are like almost 40 parents here. So I said to Rudy, I said, oh my gosh, I just forgot the yet a smaller rule of meetings. And he went, what? And I said, my mother was a professional Jew, and she always said that if you want to have a meeting, you have to serve food. It doesn't even have to be that good, but just in large portions, So what we did, we set up, I said, we're going to try something and see if it works. We're going to invite just the parents for a dinner one evening at the school, and we'll invite them. We'll serve a good dinner, and I may make some remarks about some parenting issue, and let's just see what happens. So we did that. The first time we probably had about 12 to 15 parents that showed up. We did it the next month, and we had more like over 20 parents showed up. By the time we started instituting this on a regular basis, we'd have 30 or 40 parents showing up. I would give initial remarks about a parenting issue, how to manage when you feel like your adolescent is unmanageable in terms of setting limits and such. I would give these initial remarks, and then a parent would raise their hand and say, I'm very worried about my daughter. And then another parent would say, I have the same kind of problem with my son. And then the discussion would end up being between parents, and all I was there for was to facilitate and then hopefully serve a good dinner. What we found was that every month I would announce to the group, we're having this dinner for your parents. And the students would say, no, I don't want my parents to come. I don't know what you're going to be talking about. No, I don't want my parents to come, screw that. So I would usually start the meeting with the parents. I'd say, so how many of you were told by your sons or daughters that they didn't want you to come tonight? And, like 3/4 of the parents would raise their hand. I said, well, let me tell you something. Your students are absolutely lying to you. And that's why you're here. Intuitively, you all get that. They really want you to be here more than any other place. And what we found is that the students whose parents came to these parent dinners once a month on a regular basis, those students we tracked it, started doing better academically in school. Behavioral issues started to fall and be reduced. So just that little kind of intervention, it's not an individual treatment. It's not a psychoanalysis 4 or 5 days a week, but it's based on a psychoanalytic concept. Kids want their parents' involvement. They want to be listened to. Parents want to be involved. They may temporarily just be feeling helpless because they can't manage something with an adolescent. We can all relate to that. Something gets triggered in us when our kids become adolescents. One of my colleagues used to say, college was invented when you reach that limitation with your adolescent and you don't know what else to do, you just send them to college. Okay. But when you give parents an opportunity to address some of that, and especially with other parents, the reverberation, the impact of that can be huge. I'm trying to do it now in our small little town, but these are programs that can get replicated anywhere and have an impact.
So you are creating an environment where a parent could behaviorally demonstrate they care about their child and their child's education, but also where the parent was literally receiving some extra tools emotionally to grapple with the kinds of, and find out that they're not alone, that there's a universality to the kinds of issues that they were dealing with.
And that we wanted them to be involved at the school, not because we want to come there and complain to them about what's going on with their child, with their adolescent, in a way that ends up making them feel ashamed and that's what usually goes on in many schools, but that we're going to provide something useful to help you be the parent that you really want to be.
Mm-hmm. So you're alluding to tracking and following and using that data. Can you tell us more about that?
In that project, what we found was we reduced levels of aggressive behavior, not only for the students that were being seen individually, but also those being seen in the groups. We were able to increase graduation rates in the project. And also, again, students not just to go on to college, but also to get technical kinds of training but that there is life beyond high school, and that in many instances, these students would be the first ones to graduate from high school. But I'm thinking of one example of one of the girls in our group went and visited, they had a college day and they went and visited, I think it was Northern Illinois University. And they came back and we were talking about it in the group. And I said, so how was the college visit? She said, well, it was good, but they have these things called dorms. And, you live with other girls. And I said, well, yeah. She said, well, I just started thinking these girls are going to try to get into my business and I'd have to kick their asses. And, and the social worker who I ran the group with said, whoa, time out. No. There's no fighting in the dormitory at college, but it spoke to that there's this whole world out there that these particular kids had not had access to. And hopefully our project and at the school would provide some of that.
So if you've got a model that data show helps and works. What do you think is the obstacle to this being picked up by any school, every school?
Well, it's funny that you should ask, because my wife and I are in the process of collecting data about this approach. We have a group practice in Grand Rapids and Saugatuck, and we have therapists who are part of our practice who are relatively new to the field, but we're training them in this approach, and we're starting to track the impact of it in terms of their work and also their work with patients. And we know that it's effective, but we're developing research to do that. But going out, just approaching a school and making such a modality, a way of doing things available, you can't just go out and say, oh, I have something that you might be interested in. You have to go and start talking with the school just to see what's going on. You'll forgive the expression. You have to use a psychoanalytic approach with principals, staff, and such. You start with where they're at. What kinds of issues are they having at the school, whether it's with students, staff, teachers? And then you begin to develop a relationship with the principal, if the principal and the staff are interested, and you create a project that's going to fit at this school. So right now in Saugatuck, we've just initiated starting a group of high school students and also middle school students, because the middle school is part of the high school. One of the things that the principal has made clear to me in developing this new project is how behind the middle schoolers and the freshmen and sophomores in high school are because of the pandemic. He said, and you will see when you sit down with some of the students in these groups, in terms of maturity level, how far behind they are. We've met now a couple times in the group, and it's so incredibly noticeable. Yeah, that kids
socially, emotionally,
that year and a half where kids were at home under impossible circumstances, emotionally and academically. It's going to take time for us to recover, parents and students and teachers. One of the biggest problems that and I was completely unaware of this, absenteeism has gone up in that school district by like 60%, okay? Where kids, they got used to being at home. They don't want to leave. And if they were numbing themselves in terms of this understimulated environment, they default to video games, to being downstairs. They don't want to leave the house.
So they have a lot of actually separation anxiety, right?
A huge amount of separation anxiety. And that's the kind of dynamic that we can then begin talking with teachers about and the staff about, well, how to address that? What is the anxiety about coming to school that we didn't see before the pandemic? We saw it to some extent, but nothing like it is. Rates of depression, anxiety have gone significantly up.
It's interesting. Depression and anxiety went way up. It is slowly, coming back down. It is interesting, though, just put on my psychiatry hat for a moment, that suicide rates actually did not rise. And in fact, in some instances, in some groups went down during the pandemic because school is stressful for some kids. Obviously, there are different groups of kids, but what you're speaking to, some of this separation anxiety and going back, right? And particularly in the setting of arrested social emotional development, school is also stressful. So your model of coming into the school and dealing with the teachers directly and the students directly seems that it would be very, very helpful.
Absolutely. And the stress of school, I just said to the middle school staff recently, I said, just coming into the middle school, just sitting in on these groups, it triggers for me. The worst 2 years of my life were in middle school, okay? And if I'm feeling that, I'm sure I'm not the only adult in the situation, teachers, parents, and what. But then you add on the layer of social media and what can go on at school that then gets played out in social media. It so completely exacerbates these kinds of issues that make it that much more stressful, that much more tough for adolescents to manage. And then that gets carried over into high school. And it either gets addressed in some way or it starts to interfere with academic performance. And that's where kids
So
get
how much
stuck.
do you think, though, bringing this to many other schools, is the difficulty in doing that, in your opinion, more one of resistance or more one of socioeconomic ability? I mean, obviously it costs money. And sadly, there's, I think, I would think you would agree with this, lack of insight in this country that mental health is health and that everybody is upset about the social emotional loss and learning of their kids, as well as the cognitive things that have been lost in that time. But the idea that one would fund trying to heal that, as it were, and viewing it as a health issue is not there. So how much is that the issue, the money, versus do you think even if the money was there that schools would resist entering into this?
Schools, like any organization, and you've worked with organizations before, you're aware of this. Schools have a culture, a very particular way of doing things in there. And one, when you begin to have a conversation with a principal, for example, you start to get a sense of, yeah, they would really like some solutions to this problem, but it may involve realigning or changing some things in terms of how the school responds to troubled students or what. Call it a resistance, a reluctance. I would just say it's a fear. Just like any patient who comes in and they know they want to change, but some fear is stopping them from doing that. I think the same is, I'll give you an example. We were going to start this group, have the first group meeting. Everybody in the school was on board with it. And I arrived with our intern in our practice. We have a graduate student intern who wanted experience in groups. He and I arrive at the school. The social worker who had set it up was gone at a meeting. The principal was gone to a meeting outside of the school. Somebody had been in charge of the room where we were going to meet for the first time. We get to that room. There's a class going on there. As a psychoanalyst, was this just a practical mix-up, or is there understandable reluctance? Just like with the individual, I think schools, they get presented with all kinds of programs, projects that they should try that are going to help kids emotionally, academically, and they get disappointed too when they don't work. So I think there's a understandable level of protection that schools, principals, and staff teachers have. I just returned last week, having spent 5 days with the high school service club in Dominican Republic. The service club goes down every other year. We work either in a batey, a sugarcane farm where there are immigrant families, or this time we laid the foundation and painted an elementary school. But one of the reasons that I go is not just to hang with the high school students and see what's going on, but there are 4 teachers that go. And we spend a lot of time just talking about the challenges of being a teacher, the challenges in this day and age that were exacerbated by the pandemic, but just the challenges. One of the things that all 4 teachers made clear was we can't get our students to put down their damn phones. We could take them away before they come into school, but that's not, they'll figure out a way, not to do. Students use, like we all do, but they use those phones as a way. One teacher said, the teacher said this, it's almost as if they're trying to numb themselves from learning or connecting with other people. That's a pretty significant observation. And if we can figure out and work with teachers and students in terms of, so what are we trying to numb ourselves from? What does it mean to connect, whether academically or otherwise? Maybe we could help students put the phones down. Yeah.
So do you think that you have made any inroads or could make inroads? Because I know you've done work in trying to speak to Congress. Can we use psychoanalytic concepts to help Congress understand this and address issues of community violence on a larger level?
It's interesting. While we were doing some lobbying in the last administration, we were trying to get a bill passed, this threat assessment prevention bill that took the focus off of guns, but how to intervene with adults, kids in work situations, school, universities, where some of these troubled students, for example, even before they're on what's called in this area of expertise, before they're on a pathway to violence, they're sending out signals. Every one of these mass shootings, as soon as I hear of one, I know by the next day we're going to hear about the family tried to get help. The school tried to get the family to get help. The university, somebody was posting something. A psychoanalyst is going to hear those things and say, this was that person's way to try to let somebody know by posting some violent idea or thought on the internet. This was their way of trying to let somebody know that they're in trouble. But who's going to respond to that? They haven't committed a crime, so the police are really not in a position to do anything. But is there a way to intervene? And there are programs in school districts, universities across the country who do intervene. And this threat assessment bill was to set up a federal task force. I visited the most liberal and the most conservative members of Congress to talk about this bill. I never walked out without the support of those people because it made sense. We're trying to intervene before somebody starts creating a plan or buying a gun. We had the most bipartisan support for that bill, sadly, until January 6th. And then the co-sponsors, a Democrat and a Republican, stopped speaking to one another. And the bill, it's still sitting in a committee in Congress. These kinds of ideas about how to intervene in terms of community violence, this is not about money. It's just about getting in front of the right people and getting them to buy into something that, in that instance, that you're going to you need bipartisan support, but it's doable and possible. And I think at some point that bill will get addressed again, and I may be back in D.C. doing some lobbying.
So what would the bill accomplish?
So, for example, if I'm a school district, we'll take Saugatuck Douglas School District where I live now. And actually, recently I've been part of a parent group to organize in terms of our schools, our elementary school and our high school safe. Do we need a resource officer at the school? These kinds of things are under discussion. The superintendent, who's incredibly sensitive to these issues and supportive, but one of his concerns is, where do we get the money? If we had a threat assessment and prevention bill, a TAPS bill in Congress, Saugatuck Public School could apply for a grant that for 1, 2, or 3 years would pay for a student resource officer, professional intervention when needed. The money would be there. And this bill was that money would come from Homeland Security. So I think that the money's there. I know in the state of Michigan, we're in discussion about how to get some grants that will support. And right now, it really is on people's minds in terms of mental health issues.
Absolutely. And you would think that would be bipartisan, since you are talking about, could someone be at a school who could basically be looking for and note red flags?
Absolutely.
Identify who's in trouble, who may ultimately prove a risk. And you're not talking about gun control, which obviously is tough to talk about in a bipartisan way, but really that we do know there are red flags. And as you said, these kids do telegraph and try to tell people they're red flags.
Reed Malloy, who's a member of the American Psychoanalytic Association, who is an expert at threat assessment. He consults nationally, internationally. I think he's a consultant to the royal family in London. Reed, in his publications, cites example after example. It's not just one 2 or 3 communications, I'm in trouble, I need help. It can be sometimes 10 or 12 where people are not being responded to. Families don't know what to do. A high school principal doesn't know what to do. A university, mental health, the person hasn't come for help. So how do you intervene? But there are ways to intervene. Or in the workplace, somebody hears something. I get very concerned about this in terms of tech companies are laying off people. People start reacting to that. People hear things. But when they hear things, we need to be able to respond and intervene. And many businesses, many corporations do have a sort of threat assessment protocol in place that they can intervene, not by calling the police, but by addressing something's going on with this employee. How can we get him or her some help that they need so it doesn't turn into something that could potentially become violent?
Such important work, and using psychoanalytic concepts to understand where the resistances are, right, along the chain seems so vital. Just on a personal level, before we go, what about this work has been so gratifying for you?
Years ago, I get emotional about this. The American Psychoanalytic Association gave me a service award. And it says on the plaque on my wall, Dr. Smaller brought psychoanalysis to the community and to the community back to psychoanalysis. And that has been incredibly meaningful and satisfying. I gave a presentation last night regarding psychoanalysis in China, and I work in a couple different programs. And as I was writing my presentation, I remembered this idea that I had as a young professional, a new professional. The world is this big place, huge, but the world of the individual is small. And, well, wait, if I can gain access to the subjective, private world of an individual and help them change in ways that they want, maybe I am changing the world. And yeah, this makes me feel like I'm doing a little bit in that regard.
And now for some Freudian quickies. You sent in your questions for an analyst, and I grabbed an analyst with an answer. What do psychoanalysts think about non-traditional sexual practices like fetish?
Some might be very judgmental or unskilled, have a lack of experience with understanding those kinds of dynamics, and may categorize them or pathologize them in ways that might not be helpful. I think that it's important to understand what the kink means to the patient. Are they happy with or not happy with their kink? And do they want to change it? And what does it symbolize? And what does it mean for them? Do they feel like they have choices? Can they consent to all of the various practices and relationships and power dynamics that they're involved in, et cetera?
Historically, psychoanalysts were very judgmental of unconventional sexual practices. But I think in the modern world, one can always find a psychoanalyst who understands the importance of one's sexuality and the diversity of sexual practices, and that's possible if you shop around and look around to find someone who would be both helpful and non-judgmental.
Psychoanalysts can be interested in fetishes and non-normative sexual practices or fantasies where a person might feel shamed or unable to explore these things otherwise. Fetishes and non-normative sexual practices are an opening to the unknown. So I think psychoanalysts are pretty curious and interested in these things.
Fetishes give us a kind of window into what's really meaningful for people. Sometimes, as the cliche goes, what we can't think or say, we show. And oftentimes fetish takes us into the very similar realm of being able to kind of explore the mythosymbolic, the aspects of ourselves that are so deeply held and mysterious that it's only through a certain curiosity and openness can we begin to explore what they really mean. So fetishes are a valuable insight often into the unconscious of a patient.
Can one do psychoanalysis without a couch?
Many patients walk around the room, sit on a chair, sit on a couch facing me, do yoga during analysis, etc. It's quite varied.
There are people who practice psychoanalysis without an office, with people who are unhoused. There's also the couch in psychoanalysis. These are forms that we have really been able to use, but they're not necessary.
The couch is like a hallmark of psychoanalysis, I think, in terms of what people think of psychoanalysis. But I think what it actually is a representation of what's happening between the analyst and the analyst. And so it's not necessarily the couch itself. It's the relationship that you're building and the dynamics that you're exploring. So yeah, you can definitely do psychoanalysis without a couch.
If you have a question, really any question for a psychoanalyst, send it to apsapodcast@gmail.com, and we will try to feature it in a future Freudian Quickie. For more information about the American Psychoanalytic Association, go to www.apsa.org. Till next time.